My name's Keith Kreischer. I'm the Executive Director of the IMC. Like I said, we've got a great panel, and I'll be introducing our speakers in just a moment. But first, I'd like to take 2 minutes to introduce the IMC for those on the call that may not know us. The IMC started in 2014 when a fairly eclectic group of IoT solutions providers, big telcos, MVNOs, providers of hardware and software, got together to form a trade association for the IoT sector. The group consensus was, and pretty much immediate, that we did not want to be a technical standards body nor a test bed organization. Plenty of good people working on those issues, and they are important. But we see those groups as essentially vendors talking amongst themselves. We wanted to learn more about people that buy IoT stuff. And by that, I mean enterprise users, product makers and designers, apps developers that buy connectivity, hardware and software to connect devices in the field. What did those people look like? What did they need? And how could we help them? We started by putting out content, pretty much anything we could get our hands on, white papers, use cases, blog entries, newsletters. And we did not ask people that wanted access to the content to pay us anything, but we did ask them to self-identify as buyers, not sellers, to join our organization as adopted members and give us permission to talk to them, and crucially, to give us fairly extensive tabulatable demographic information. That whole effort turned out to be much more successful than we could have hoped. The IMC today has 25,000 rank and file adopted members from around the globe, covering 24 different vertical markets, everything from automotive manufacturing to building and construction to retail point of sale. We get 200 new members weekly. They come to us inbound. We don't recruit them, and we do curate the membership to keep them around 25,000. We consider our adopter membership rolls to be the largest market segmentation study ever conducted for the IoT sector. The IMC board now includes some of the largest companies in the industry, AWS, HPE, Tata, Vodafone, but also smaller, influential solutions providers. And we see ourselves as an accelerator. Our mission is bringing together buyers and sellers to expand the adoption of IoT technology. And we look at today's webinar on different forms of IoT connectivity to be exactly in keeping with that mission. With that, I'll introduce our speakers. First up will be Samuel Roper, Head of Smart Verticals at EDOT DigiWorld. Sam has been with EDOT since 2007. His assignments specifically involve technology expertise for IoT. He focuses on technology and marketing innovations with special emphasis on automotive. Welcome to our webinar, Samuel. Thanks for being here.
Hello, guys.
Next up will be Ajay Joseph. Ajay is CTO at iBASIS with over 30 years of experience in the telecoms industry. He's responsible for strategy and engineering of the iBASIS global network. He's been with the company for 10 years, instrumental in their growth from a startup to one of the world's largest international carriers. Welcome, Ajay.
Thank you very much, Keith. Welcome to be here. Glad to be here.
Thanks so much. Now, before we get started, I'll just reiterate something that David said earlier. We do encourage you in the audience to submit questions during the presentations. We will address those at the end of our session. If we don't get to your question, never fear. We will have a record of it associated with your registration, which our speakers can address after this event. And with that, I will hand off to Samuel Roper to lead us off with an overview of connectivity markets for IoT. Sam, take us away.
Thank you. So I will start. Thank you. So first, as mentioned before, I am the head of IoT and smart vertical practice at EDOT DigiWorld. As a reminder, EDOT DigiWorld is a leading think tank and a market intelligence company specialized in the telecom market. We published a report in late 2019 where we look at the market opportunities for the main LPWAN technologies, which is a market addressed by iBASIS. LPWAN technologies refers to low power, wide area network technologies and have therefore three key characteristics: low energy consumption, long range, low cost, as the ARPU for the telecom operators is supposed to be much more lower than for a traditional 2G, 4G ARPU. So, LPWAN IoT market is enjoying tremendous growth, especially with a breakdown per region. So in total, according to our prediction, the LPWAN market should reach 1.7 billion objects by 2025 from less than 400 million units in 2020 or less than 150 million units in 2018, which represents 35% annual growth since from 2020. But you need to have in mind that more than half of this install base will be located in Asia Pacific and mainly in China. Europe should be the second zone, followed by the North American zone. Then we're gonna move on to the slide where there is a distribution on the vertical market. So, like the classic IoT, the growth is not homogeneous, but heterogeneous, as it varies among the vertical segments. The very first sector is utilities, with use cases around electricity, gas, and water meters. The first two use cases are driven mainly by regulation and public policies. The second largest vertical market is logistics, a very high volume sector with 450 million units in 2025, and with the highest annual growth. Indeed, even a small IoT adoption here represents millions of connected objects. Just as a reminder to give you just a figure, there are around 12 billion pallets worldwide today in circulation. So these two sectors, utilities and logistics, will account for 80% of total opportunities in volume by 2025. Of course, these markets will be addressed by different technologies. Today, two major families are really competing, I would say, the unlicensed and the licensed one. Among the licensed one, we count more than 25 different technologies, mainly thanks to the absence of spectrum acquisition, which is a real barrier to entry in the telecom world. Currently, two technologies stand out: Sigfox, which is the LPWAN pioneer, and LoRa, which is developing especially through private networks today. On the public network configuration, their global footprint is nonetheless quite limited, as their current focus is Europe today. And their current coverage, where they are really implemented, is still far away from 100% of the population. So the licensed technologies only count two technologies per se. We distinguish NB-IoT and LTE-M, which have the advantage of being standardized technology, even though the technical performances are not as strong as Sigfox or LoRa, for instance. Of course, NB-IoT and LTE-M will suffer from various drawbacks, like the absence of the roaming feature implemented by default. But we do at IDAT believe that these kind of issues should be removed in the near future. Just in terms of coverage, according to the GSMA, around 40 LTE-M networks are already rolled out by MNOs as of January 2020, so earlier this year. And GSMA reported as well a total of 93 NB-IoT networks also deployed by the MNOs, which stands for around 70% of all mobile IoT network. So in other words, today there are 3 times more NB-IoT networks deployed compared to LTE-M networks. And the final slide for this introduction, we look at the technology breakdown. So in terms of distribution, NB-IoT is expected to be the main technology, and by far. The combination of LTE-M and NB-IoT, which is the iBASIS market, is expected to capture around 30% of the total IoT market by the end of 2025, and to enjoy more than 50% growth over the period, annual growth, of course. Today, most of these connections are coming from Asia Pacific zone, mainly from China. Just to give you a figure at the end of last year, in China, the cumulative NB-IoT connection were officially around less than 100 million units at the end of last year. So that's it for this introduction. Just a wrap-up of our activity. We provide a think tank activity, consulting and market intelligence opportunities and activities. Thank you for your attention, and I let AJ to continue this webinar. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Samuel. Really appreciate it. It was a very nice overview. Great stuff. With that, I will hand things off to Ajay Joseph of iBASIS. Ajay, take us away.
Thanks, Keith. Thanks, Samuel. I hope you guys can hear me. Well, just a quick introduction. I'm Ajay Joseph, the head of the IoT unit at iBASIS, as well as the CTO. What I'm going to talk about is 2 different items. One is walking you through what are typical pain points that we see with respect to our customers, and what kind of solutions out there in the 4G space, and how do we connect to it as well. And the second is also based on what we do right now, how does that fit in with what is happening in the 5G space, okay? So just a quick round of introduction about who iBASIS is. This is not meant to be a sales pitch, but more information. Very quickly, we are a large wholesaler, so we buy from MNOs and we sell either back to other MNOs or to enterprises. That's typically the business that we're in. We've been owned by a combination of private equity, management, venture capital, and our strategy has been aggregating more and more of the international players that you see around here. We have very, very strong relationships with operators across the world. Just last week, we acquired the international portfolio of the Portuguese operator, NOS. And so that is part of the iBASIS strategy, which is to continue working with international operators and bringing together the overall portfolio. There are 3 businesses that iBASIS operates. One is an international long-distance voice business. The second is a mobility roaming business, where we enable 4G roaming between operators. And the third business is the IoT business, and I'm going to talk a little bit about getting into that in terms of what are the key pain points that we're going to be getting into, and then, how do we actually solve that? So just a quick, we have POPs located across the world. They're all interconnected between each other with an MPLS network. Those POPs also, in turn, are connected to cloud service providers. And inside those POPs, you have all the different gear that can basically cater to those different businesses. This is a sampling of some of the operators and the customers that are part of our portfolio. This is a very small sampling. We are, I believe, we're connected to something like 300 plus mobile operators across the world. So this is just a very small sampling. So just in terms of pain points, typically, what do IoT customers, what are we seeing in terms of pain points that they have? And so the first is, you take an example of a car company. So a car company manufactures cars, and most of these cars need connectivity. When they need connectivity, the cars are shipped all across the world. And it's not just the car company. I'm just using that as an example. So when they get shipped all across the world, the question is, the car company typically has to be working with these MNOs all across the world. It's difficult working with, one MNO. Think of working with 50, 60, 70 MNOs across the world. So that becomes a big, big challenge. What happens is the customer in this case, as opposed to focusing on customer acquisition, has to be focused on something else, which is the entire connectivity issue. So that is a really big problem that we've seen. The second is what we've also seen in a particular country or in countries, not so much the smaller countries, but the bigger countries, is you may get connectivity from a particular operator, but typically the operator does not have the ability, physically, commercially, all of that, to cover the entire country from a coverage point of view. It could be coverage, it could be price, it could be technology, it could be a combination of all kinds of things. So you cannot get your service, especially when it comes to things that we call critical communications, with a particular operator. So it starts becoming a big challenge. The third thing is the experience that you get, the service that you get with respect to the connectivity and the resulting services, the experience along the way of the latency, the experience relative to the regulation, security, all of that, that starts becoming a very important player itself in this entire, among the pain points. So something that we saw when we started the business was a development in the marketplace, which is a new kind of SIM called an embedded SIM. By the way, this is still evolving. I can talk about that later. So the embedded SIM basically looks like a regular SIM. It feels like a regular SIM, but it's not a regular SIM. So the difference is the embedded SIM can be programmed remotely with the credentials of the operator. And so as it gets turned on, the embedded SIM can take on the credential of a different operator based on whatever the business logic is. So in a way, think of it as an open, unlocked eSIM. Okay? So where if an operator does not have particular coverage, we have the ability of moving over to a different operator or any other business logic that you have in there. The eSIM that I'm talking about is a standardized eSIM. It's standardized as per the GSM Association. And so it's not something that has a scare factor relative to, from a security point of view, that you typically get working with proprietary solutions like multi-IMSI solutions. In terms of how does this work, so if you're a customer like a car company, for example, you get this embedded SIM and eSIM, it typically gets baked inside, the device, baked as in what I mean is connected, all the way at manufacturing time. So that eSIM essentially comes with a combination of profiles either already on the card. Profiles are also, AKA, also known as the operator credentials. And so these profiles can also be downloaded over the air So when a car gets shipped over to the U.S., figure out that it has the ability of taking on it is in the U.S., and it has the ability of sending down a different profile. And all of that is being done with this mobile network selection logic, okay? And so it can select based on the operator based on different criteria. So just put it business logic over there. The data coming out from the devices for both quality reasons as well as security / regulatory reasons, the data is kept within region so as not to sort of preserve all of both the quality as well as any kind of privacy / GDPR restrictions that could be existing in that particular area. We do have the ability of controlling what comes out from the data, changing data, throttling data, sending it to particular places, blocking, unblocking. There's a whole bunch of stuff that could be done with that. And top of all of that, the management and the analytics. And I have a slide later on that also exposes a lot of this functionality via APIs to the outside. So if you're a savvy developer that wants to do all of this via API interfaces, you have the ability of doing that. Now, all of this is enabled across, I haven't shown 2G here, but it's across all the LPWA technologies like LTE-M, NB-IoT, 4G, 2G, 3G, and as the 5G networks are coming on, we will be ready for that, but all of these are ready today. So in terms of added security, one of the nice things about the SIM is that, the customers that you work with, this will become very important, especially if there are enterprises that actually deem security very important. So the SIM has a trust zone. By having keys inside the SIM card, you can have TLS encryption all the way from the device all the way to the cloud, end-to-end encrypted. And so this kind of takes away the concern that a lot of organizations have in terms of, the data getting snooped upon, all of that. Data sovereignty, I had mentioned it earlier. That's possible as well, in keeping the data as local as possible or regional. And the next thing is permanent roaming. So this becomes important with some operators, where operators are very finicky about, the data that they sell you. How does that line up with the consumer sales, for example? And there could also be regulatory reasons why a particular country may have limitations on how long can somebody roam onto the country. So it's important to think about all of these, and that's one of the reasons why it's useful to have an eSIM where you could have a local profile doing the work as opposed to having a local roaming profile. Just quickly, a lot of these functions, both on the devices side, the device management reporting, as well as the connectivity management and media control. So specifically in terms of turning on, off a device, how many SIMs are there, the reporting of, the CDRs, how much of data was used, the changing of the profiles being the credentials, policies associated with the SIM card. All of these are exposed via APIs to the developer if need be. Now, how does all of this connect with with 5G and what are we doing in that space? I just want to quickly go through that. So if you guys can see this eye chart on the right, actually it's only now that I look at it and I see that it is an eye chart. But I'll pick out what's the difference between 4G and 5G. So the things that are important from a consumer point of view or a customer point of view is, one, is the data rates. So if you look at the typical peak data rates that you see in 4G at 100 megabits per second, and you see what is the comparable in 5G, it's 20 gigabits per second. So it increases by 200 times. At the same time, the other important thing that stands out in 5G, and just want to bring these out because it starts talking about the different set of use cases in 5G compared to 4G. In 4G, the typical latency that you see on the radio access side is about 10 milliseconds. And in 5G, it's about 1 millisecond. And so these combinations basically give rise to a set of what we call use cases along 3 different dimensions. Okay, so one is massive IoT, which is along the lines of using low power. It's use cases which are similar to what Samuel discovered in his presentation on smart cities, logistics, utilities, all of that. There's going to be a lot of that, and that's where we see the big growth in the IoT numbers. Yeah. The second is what we call critical communications. And so critical communications being the use cases around use cases that need that very tight latency of, that sub-millisecond latency. It's typically going to be done more on the local side, vehicle-to-vehicle communication, for example. So your vehicle trying to communicate to the vehicle in front of you, it needs to be extremely fast. If not, you're going to get into all kinds of trouble there. Factory automation, autonomous vehicles are going to need this as well. And the third bucket is what we called, today what we do with 4G, all of us do it, is mobile broadband, but this is enhanced mobile broadband. So given the data speeds increasing by, the peak data speeds increasing by about 200 times, it's a totally different set of use cases where you're talking about more immersive communications, augmented reality, 3D conferencing. So those are the kind of use cases that are expected. Now, in terms of, if you look at the entire suite of technologies that are available from an IoT point of view, it actually starts becoming quite mature when you start looking at it. There's quite an arsenal to choose from. So you have all the way from like the low power cases, massive IoT, depending on your use case. So if you want a use case that actually does, you don't care about high throughputs, what you care more about is preserving your battery life, getting battery life about 10 years perhaps. That's when you start looking at NB-IoT, provided your network can actually give you the right kind of support. And it's not just the network, but also the components that go with it. The same thing with LTE-M. LTE-M is also another low power technology, but it has higher throughput than NB-IoT. The use cases being it's not that stringent on battery life. It's still stringent, but not as stringent as what you would expect with NB-IoT. You also have the ability of doing voice with LTE-M. Now, one of the interesting things about NB-IoT, one way of actually preserving the battery life here is the IP stack directly is removed from the device. And so a lot of the data transfer can also be done via the signaling side as well. And so that's a mechanism to drive the battery usage even more. It's still not widely deployed, that variation we're talking about. And then if you fast forward into on the higher data side, you have 4G today, which has the ability of transporting pretty significant amounts of data. And with 5G as well, you have the same functionality, but at a magnitude, at a scale, which is significantly higher. But what also 5G gives you is the critical communication part, which is the tight latencies I was talking about. So which could be useful in V2V communications, real-time robotics, any kind of remote vehicles, so on and so forth. Now, in terms of, so what exactly is going on with respect to massive IoT? So I just wanted to touch upon those three bubbles that we saw in the beginning. So in massive IoT, so some of the use cases that are going on right now with respect to both NB-IoT as well as LTE-M, solutions such as trash can detectors, the level in the trash can, for example, tamper, tracking solutions, packaging solutions. And so today, iBASIS has teamed up with Nordic Semiconductor, where the Nordic modems, which basically support both LTE-M and NB-IoT, are shipped with iBASIS SIM cards. And you have the ability of actually having LPWAN capability across 24 countries today. So that is enabled today. And all of this could be integrated via those APIs that I was showing you earlier. Okay. If you look at some of the other use cases that we have in the LPWAN segment, we just brought on a new customer called HeartStation. What HeartStation does is they enable remote monitoring of AEDs. These are the machines that basically act as the defibrillators. And so monitoring the power on those AEDs, this becomes very important because a lot of AEDs that you find around you, a lot of them are there, but they've run out of power for whatever reason. And so this is a useful service to monitor how those are doing so as to be fully prepared in case of an emergency. Another use case is a customer called McLeod. They use it for real-time and advanced tracking and horse racing. That was put to use in France recently. On the critical communication side, so critical communications, the way we view it, is that it is beyond the low latency critical communications. So the use cases where we look at critical communications are and especially with the situation we are in right now, where you have medical personnel, for example, that are, or it could be police or in any kind of emergency vehicles, for example. They could be somewhere in the countryside and they have connectivity, but the connectivity could be fading out and they do need connectivity with somebody else. So there's no way of actually guaranteeing that. And so what we do with our solution is on the SIM card, we have the ability of actually putting on credentials of different operators, and this is all being done via standards. And we switch on the appropriate operator based on the one that has the signal strength. And so that becomes important from a critical communication point of view. Some of the other aspects of it in terms of keeping the data as local as possible so as to prevent any long latency, as to get the shortest response times, that also becomes very important in critical communication. And the last one I want to touch upon is the enhanced mobile broadband piece. And so we're doing a lot of this today with respect to the mobile business. We do today with several operators across the board. And the use cases, I had mentioned this already, as in like immersive media, augmented reality, virtual reality. So one of the things that we are seeing in the marketplace today is as 5G networks become real, and slowly we are seeing deployments across the board. The way of operators start today with respect to the EMBB is they start with a 5G radio, and the core of the network still stays 4G. And the reason for that is because it's an expensive upgrade. So we are seeing already traffic through our network with respect to 5G. It's called the NSA mode, non-standard mode, non-standard access, non-standalone access. And so we are seeing that today. The next phase in 5G with respect to the deployment is where the 4G core comes off and there's a full-scale upgrade to essentially making it totally 5G. one of the elements that iBASIS plays a role in with respect to the service that we provide is to enable the signaling between the operators. And for that, one of the things that we are doing is to enable a sandbox between operators to help them essentially test before they deploy. And so if any of you are interested in this, please get in touch with us. Okay. And so today we actually provide a lot of 4G MBB services. We are getting prepared to actually make the transition to the eMBB with respect to our customers, because there's a protocol change from diameter to HTTP. And we're enabling the sandbox to help test that entire end-to-end functionality. So just to summarize, the eSIM that we have is ready today for the current use cases and the pain points we see in the marketplace. We have a lot of LPWAN that we're doing today. We expect that to be exploding. And what we're doing, we see, is in line with where things are going in 5G. And the case of massive IoT, which is what we are expecting to be, the big explosion towards 2020, we already see the beginnings of that. And so that is currently happening. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Keith.
Wow, thanks so much, Ajay. Terrific stuff. Really a deep dive into current state of pretty much all forms of IoT connectivity. Thanks so much. Really appreciate it. And I learned more than a few things just there. With that, we'll begin our Q&A part of the presentation. And I've got a lot of questions coming in, but I'd like to start off with a topical question. And perhaps we can start off with Samuel regarding COVID-19. Specifically, what is the impact of the virus on LPWAN applications, and what are the best applications that we can take advantage of given the current situation? Sam? Might want to check that mute button, Sam.
Okay. Do you hear me? Yes?
Yeah, I got you now.
Okay. So the IoT deployment pace depends on the global economic environment for sure. But even though the impact should vary among vertical markets, because logistics, the core business is strongly impacted right now. Whereas in the same time, agriculture is not that much. We expect some delays and even some cancellations, depending also, and again, on the financial impact for industrials. You have to keep in mind that the majority, let's say 90% of the current IoT deployments are implemented for internal use. With a cost-saving objective. So maybe we can compare this current situation to the 2008 financial downturn, where deployment have been massively delayed, or even for some of them cancelled.
Right on. Ajay, anything to add to that?
Yeah, so we're seeing mixed things in IoT with respect to the COVID virus out there. So, the parts of the business that actually need what we call high data use relative to backhaul. Backhaul could be primary backhaul of data or backup backhaul. Use cases being either at home, it could be medical facilities, it could be all of that. There is actually more and more of a push to get that out there. One of the verticals that we do cater to is the entire cruise ship industry. That is more or less it doesn't exist right now. Most people know why. The other aspects in terms of enterprise mobility, the semiconductor business, the entire LPWAN thing, what we see is things are have slowed down slightly, but it's not. But there's a lot of orders getting placed, and so it's what we expect is once in the next month or two, we expect because the supply chain on the China side is more or less improved, we expect most of that stuff to be recovering. That's the hope. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I guess it's kind of a dichotomy, and everyone's kind of still waiting a little bit. Is that correct on my part? I mean, waiting to see how things shake out.
Yeah.
I've got a bunch of questions about sort of the relationship between NB-IoT and LTE-M. Can you, and I would direct this at you, Ajay, how do you see those things relating to each other? Do you see one or the other being adopted as part of 5G? Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So I can tell you what I see from, and I know Sam is going to tell me after this, what I see from analysts and what I see from in practice. So in terms of not just analysts, but also what I see in terms of forecasts everywhere is that NB-IoT is going to just dominate like rapidly. The stuff we see in the field is that LTE-M is a lot easier to work with, okay? And it's easier to work with multifold. One is, especially if you need connectivity in a lot of countries across the world, you may not have profiles everywhere. You need roaming to work. NB-IoT roaming did not start as being defined. It is now being worked on. LTE-M, from a roaming point of view, does work. It does work in several countries. What is more critical with respect to both of these services is not so much getting them to work, but it's also the particular features that they provide. So there are at least two features that we care about. One is what's called the PSM functionality in EDRX, essentially the power saving mode. Because if you don't have the power saving mode, I mean, having this is kind of pointless, okay? And so it's important when you work with the operator in question that the operator has turned that on, it works, your device works with it, you know the appropriate configurations that are needed to make that happen. So the entire world is pretty complex. It's not straightforward. What we see is we see more demand with respect to our customers for LTE-M. We believe that over time that's going to start transitioning over to NB-IoT, okay? Because there are a lot more networks that have deployed NB-IoT domestically.
Right. Do you see any sort of geographic emphasis there, Ajay, in terms of one standard or the other? Is one, just to give an example, is one of those more used in Europe than another? And does the roaming the roaming functionality is it working when it comes to NB-IoT? Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so the roaming function with NB-IoT is very scarce, okay? So it doesn't really work very well. It works in some networks, but doesn't work very well. With LTE-M, it's a lot more prevalent. From a regional point of view, what we see is the preponderance in the U.S. market is more LTE-M. What we see is there's a lot more NB-IoT that is deployed like domestically across several networks in like parts of Europe. When we look at Europe, there's definitely a lot more NB-IoT than LTE-M. But getting them to work across networks for NB-IoT, as I said earlier, becomes a real challenge.
Right, and there is a suggestion among the questions that the LPWAN chipsets, they support low cost and low energy consumption applications, and might that have the effect of pushing NB-IoT out of the market?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know, because a lot of the modems that we see are ones that are dual, that have the capability of doing both. Now, if your question is it going to push the NB-IoT modems out of the market? Is that your question?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I'm kind of combining a bunch of questions at once, but I think the short answer is yes. I mean, the question is, since LTE-M can support those functionalities, is there really a place for NB-IoT?
Yeah, of course. And as I said earlier, right, the use case that NB-IoT is at least meant for is a different use case, which is a lot more stringent than what you typically get out from LTE-M. Now, if you need your 10 years of battery life, for example, with all of this PSM and all of that supported, you probably need something like the likes of an NB-IoT to drive your battery usage down to those kind of levels. And so it's going to be a need. The question is, how widely adopted is that going to be between networks and for the massive adoption of that particular technology? And I think it'll get there. As with anything, as with any of these technologies, if you guys remember when 4G first came out, remember how many bands were there? And each and every device that came out could only work in particular countries, could not work in any other country. And so, if you remember, Apple had different SKUs for different countries, and ultimately they came out with a chip that could actually handle at least the most important ones from a market point of view. And so it's happening. So we've spoken to several operators. They're actually working on enabling the interoperability between different networks. And so I would expect by sometime next year that's going to be there on the NB-IoT side.
Right. With that, I'd like to, change gears a little bit and direct something at Sam about use cases, specifically in utilities and logistics. Samuel, why do you see those as sort of leading lights over the next couple of years? What's happening there?
Well, the question is related to NB-IoT, LTE-M, or LPWAN in general?
I think it's an open question in that regard.
Okay.
What are the main use cases in those two markets? And,
okay.
Why is it we see such strong growth there?
Okay. So in IoT in general and in volume, I mentioned.
I'm sorry, Sam, I'm not following that. I think he may have cut out on us. With that, let me shift gears and come back to Ajay. Ajay, still lots of questions about LTE versus NB-IoT. Does something referred to in a question as open network independence allow selection of LTE or NB-IoT?
Could you repeat the question again, Keith?
Sure. Does open network independence, quote unquote, allow selection of LMR or LTE or NB-IoT?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so what happens is today, at least the way how most the eSIM technology is built, mostly, okay, and this is what we found. You could have the open network independence specifically with regular LTE, with LTE-M. With NB-IoT, it becomes difficult, and it becomes difficult just out of the bat, and that's something that we're working on right now. which is you typically need the help of SMS or some kind of vehicle like that to enable the switching between different profiles. And a lot of NB-IoT devices do not have that SMS stack. And so we're looking at other ways in terms of how to create that switching. So I would think that by the end of this year, we're going to be coming up with something. So it's not an easy thing to do.
Right. And also lots of questions about LTE-M versus NB-IoT in China. Apparently NB-IoT is sort of the standard over there. Your thoughts on that?
All we know, we actually do have a profile with a Chinese profile, for example. We do have that one on our system. We do know it is NB-IoT is what's been deployed. It's something what the Chinese operators have actually tried to standardize right from the very beginning. Is there any particular reason why they've gone NB-IoT versus LTE-M? I don't know. I do know there's a preponderance of NB-IoT over there. I don't know what the actual reason is.
Right. This is an interesting question and almost a philosophical question. I'm not sure if Sam's back with us, but Sam, if you are, just give us a shout. We may have lost connectivity with them. But this is certainly a question that I'm sure iBASIS has pondered. What the regulators and policymakers need to do to accelerate the rollout of IoT applications. What are the leading countries and regions doing differently? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's actually a really, really good question, whoever asked that. I think the one thing they should do is the first is get the folks that are actually involved in this business at the policy level together. And it's not only the operator. Because what happens is the operator obviously has an interest in terms of what they have to do. And don't forget, the operator is investing a lot of money in terms of these new technologies. So they have to get their return on business. But in terms of one is the allocation of spectrum, that's one. How to streamline that entire process, what more to be releasing. But beyond that, I'm not a big advocate in terms of pricing plans and things like that, but to have a faster adoption, especially when you look at the regional bodies like the EU, for example. I think they should be coming down a lot faster in terms of how to make the likes of like roaming between the operators a lot faster. And I think it's going to happen over time, but especially with something like NB-IoT that has a lot of promise, if something like that could be at least instilled from a policy point of view, it could help the industry a lot.
Right. Let's a related question. What about IoT security? Lots of questions there. Obviously, it's at the forefront of all the regulatory activity. Talk to us a little about that, and perhaps specifically as it relates to eSIM.
Yeah, so I actually alluded to that in my presentation. So one of the things we have the ability of doing is because the SIM is in a trust zone. At manufacturing time, we have the ability of putting in private keys in the trust zone of the SIM with our suppliers who have secure facilities. And between that and what you typically see in the cloud, like in AWS cloud, for example, you could actually have keys in the AWS cloud as well. And with that, you could have end-to-end encryption. So that's one. The second is between there to our customer sites, we could also have end-to-end private connections. And so for the most part, we could have what we deem as encrypted communications all the way from the device to where you need to go to in your data center. Okay, so with that in mind, it's a big concern, especially with enterprises. There's several enterprises who do not want their communication going out on the open internet or are susceptible to denial of service attacks. So those kind of threats get mitigated with what we can do.
Okay. Yeah, I get it. I guess also a related question is, are there particular communications standards that eSIM is better suited to, NB-IoT versus LTE-M? Is one or the other, better suited to the eSIM, and how does that work?
Yeah. So right now, based on what we see, LTE-M is better suited to the eSIM. But based on what we are working on, we believe we're going to get the NB-IoT working with respect to the switching as well. And so, yeah, so it's, as I mentioned earlier, NB-IoT has got certain limitations, but if you look at it hard and work on it, you should be able to fix it.
Right. And it almost sounds like Sam has been able to rejoin us.
Yes.
Samuel, are you with us? Thanks for getting back.
I've been disconnected. Sorry. Good to hear.
No worries. I'm going to finish up with a final question, and Sam, I'll start with you. What is your prediction about industrial IoT deployment over the next several years? Obviously, we see it growing, but how important is it relative to other IoT applications?
Well, again, the IoT adoption varies among vertical markets. We see a lot of traction in logistics, where you can have obvious cost savings and a short ROI, return on investment. We also see huge traction on automotive and utilities, because for those vertical markets, there are many regulation and public policies which drive those markets and those IoT adoptions. Regarding LPWA, the key traction is coming from China, especially on NB-IoT. I think there were plenty of questions on that topic. I mean, the real source of NB-IoT connection is coming from China today. Elsewhere, we see traction on LTE-M, as AJ mentioned previously. But in the coming years, we see also some investigation from industrial regarding 5G deployment, especially through private 5G networks. We see a lot of traction on that in Germany, because some of industrials are purchasing spectrum, 5G spectrum for internal use in their factory, for instance. So the manufacturing industry is also looking at this kind of development, even in the short term.
Right. Ajay, anything to add to that?
No, I tend to agree. I mean, in the short term, it's basically what we're seeing is a big push with LTE-M. And I would believe in the next year or so, NB-IoT is going to become more and more prevalent.
Right. With that, gentlemen, I thank you so much for your time. We are a couple of minutes past the hour. We did get to a lot of the questions, but perhaps not all. If we did not get to your question, those members of the audience that put some forward, like I said, we do have them. They are logged and associated with your registration, so our speakers will be able to get back to you after the event. Just want to thank Ajay and Samuel again so much for joining us, as well as to all the members of our audience. We really appreciate folks taking the time in what is a complicated and difficult time. Hoping everyone out there stays safe and well. And please join us next week. Speaking of IoT, for a summit we're putting on. I know Jay will be there, and we'll have a whole lineup of speakers. Please visit the IMC website to check that out. Once again, thanks everybody for your time. And with that, we will sign off. David?
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.